So I just wanted to talk today about the upcoming feature in Octopus Deploy called Spaces, um, and of course the related feature of the permissions changes that we've been working on as part of that. This is sort of a high-level talk, just making sure everyone's on the same page with regards to what Spaces is, what that means for Octopus, what that means for our customers. I'll be giving another talk at a later date with a bit more technical information for developers within Octopus, telling them more about what they need to know. So, what are Spaces? Spaces is a new feature that allows you to group everything within Octopus and isolate things within Octopus into separate, distinct partitions. So you can imagine organizations that have multiple teams. One particular team works with their own set of, say, projects, environments, tenants, machines, and so on. And they only touch those particular resources. They don't touch all of the projects and environments and so on that other teams work with. They don't want to see anything that's even been created by those other teams. They just don't want to know about them at all. They only want to see what's important to them. And that's what Spaces is. That gives you a way of isolating and segregating your data within Octopus. I'm going to jump straight into the UI here, because I think this is the easiest way to just understand Spaces. It's conceptually quite a simple feature, and there's not a lot of UI to show off, but we'll have a look. So there's this new top-level navbar item right at the very left here, which is the space switcher. That's just an icon to start with. This will always be shown. When I expand this, you'll see it's got this nice onboarding graphic to kind of describe what Spaces is about, link you to documentation, prompt you to create a new space. It also shows you what space you're in at the top. So when you first install or upgrade to a version of Octopus with Spaces, we put everything that you have into a default space that we just call default. And we show this onboarding in the space switcher if you only have that one space. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a second space here. I'm going to click on Add Space. It takes me to a new Spaces menu section within the configuration menu. And you can see here I've only got one space at the moment, which is the default space. I'm going to add a second space here. I'll just call it second space. I'm going to add my administrators as the owner of that space. I'll talk a little bit more later about what it means to be a space owner. And I'll leave the rest as the default. And I'll save that. If I jump back to the spaces now, I now have two spaces. I've got the default space and I've got the second space. If I expand the space switcher now, you'll see that there are now two spaces shown. You can see once again that I'm still within the default space, but I now have the option of clicking and switching to the second space. See, things pretty much look the same over in this space. The only real difference that you might note is that there's now a space ID in the URL. If I navigate to any of these sections within the space, that space ID remains. And if I expand the space switcher at any point, you can see that I'm always within the second space. I can easily jump back to the default space at any point, and I'm now in a space that has a different space ID in the URL. I'm going to go ahead now and just create some things. I'm just going to create a life cycle. That's a new type of life cycle. I'll just call this custom life cycle. So I've got two life cycles here. Once again, I'm in the first or the default space at this point. I'm going to go and I'm going to create a project as well. So I'm going to create my project. Now for my project here, I'm going to select the custom lifecycle that I've created. So I can see that there are two options here, the default lifecycle and the custom lifecycle. I'll pick the custom one, and I've created that project now. If I go to the dashboard, I can see my project here. Now, if I switch to the second space, once again, I'm on the dashboard, but I see no projects here. If I go to the project screen, there's just no projects. So I can't see that project that I've created in the first space when I'm within the second space. If I go to the library as well and the life cycles, I only see the default life cycle for this second space. I don't see that extra second custom life cycle that I created in the first space. It's just not visible here. Now, if I try to create a project within the second space, if I try to pick the life cycle for this project, I can see that I only have access to the life cycles that exist within this second space. I can't see that extra custom life cycle that I created within the first space. So that gives me really strong isolation between all of the resources within a specific space. They just can't see or access resources from other spaces in the way that this project or this new project can't see or access the custom lifecycle I created in the other space. One other thing I just want to highlight while we're here, if we go back to the spaces menu, you'll see that the default space has this special chip on it to indicate that it is the default space. And there's even an option here in the overflow menu to disable the default space. So the default space has a very special meaning here. The default space is a mechanism by which we preserve backwards compatibility when you first upgrade to a version of Octopus that has spaces. So in the API, you now have to explicitly define what space each request is targeting. That's something that you'll need to do going forward. But when you first upgraded to a version with spaces, obviously you wouldn't, all of your existing scripts won't have that explicit space ID in them yet. The default space is kind of just a backwards compatibility mechanism by which if you don't have the space ID in a route for an API request, we will essentially redirect it to the default space, or assume that you intended that request to be targeted at the default space. And this happens in the UI as well. If I remove that spaces2ID from the route here and reload, it'll automatically put me into the default space. And that's based on this particular property represented by the default chip here. So that's pretty much the whole UI that we have for spaces. Hopefully that gives you some idea about what they are. So what value do we see spaces providing for our customers? I see it as providing three sort of different areas of value. The first one being that it limits what you can see. And by that I mean, imagine you're a customer that has a huge number of projects, say 1,000 projects or 1,000 environments. Most of the time, you're only interacting with a small set of those projects, or at least some subset of those projects. You don't want to see those 1,000 projects. Like, what does it mean to go to a dashboard and see just a list of 1,000 projects and where they've been deployed? It's not really that useful. So it's really about reducing the information overload that you get when you're in the UI, and even when you're hitting the API as well. But secondarily, it's also about isolating the data that you can access. So I showed you this before in the UI with the project that could only access life cycles from within the same space. So it doesn't just limit what you can see, it limits what your resources can see as well. They can only see things that are within the same space most of the time. The second thing that it does is that it allows you to simplify permissions. So our permission system is already pretty complex and difficult for users to understand when they have to set up a lot of custom permissions. And in some respect, we've made the situation a little bit more complex because we've introduced a new dimension to permissions, which is spaces. However, we're anticipating that on balance, it should make your permissions configurations simpler rather than more complex. The reason being that permissions are now assigned on a per space basis. So you configure permissions within a space, and you configure permissions within a space at a time. So today, if you have a huge number of resources, you might want to scope a particular user down to a specific set of projects that they care about. In a world where spaces exist, you might instead give that user unscoped access to everything within the particular space that they're operating within. And this means that in a lot of cases, you will end up with far simpler permissions because you don't have to scope things as much as you currently need to do. And scoping really is the more complex side of permissions. The other way that it simplifies permissions is that you can delegate the assignment of permissions to someone else within your organization. At the moment, you might have a system admin who's got access to everything. You go to that person whenever you want to get new permissions, whenever you want to get access to something that you don't currently have access to. I showed you there was that space owner property that exists on spaces now, and the primary responsibility of the space owner is to assign permissions within space. So the system administrator can now delegate that responsibility to someone else, rather than having one person needing to know about all of the permissions in your organization and manage them all. The third thing that Spaces gives you is hopefully an improvement in your performance. This is something that we're working towards, but we haven't actually demonstrated that we've achieved this goal yet. But that's something that we intend to do soon. You can imagine how we've implemented Spaces. We've added a space ID property, a space ID column to most tables within the database. It's an indexed column. Most queries that come in most requests that come in are scoped to a specific space, and therefore all the queries that hit the database are also scoped to that specific space as well. Which means that if you do manage to segregate your data into separate spaces, then you're simply just querying less data, which means everything should be faster. Imagine you've got 1,000 projects today, and then tomorrow you move to Spaces and you split them up into 2 spaces, each with 500 projects. You're acting on half the data, so you might expect query times to take half as long. But in a lot of cases, especially those cases where we do have performance problems, it might even be far better than that, because consider that you might be calculating combinations of different data. For example, you might be evaluating the cross product of tenants and projects. So if either tenants or projects or both are halved, then you've improved performance by more than a factor of 2. As I said, we haven't gotten any numbers or demonstrated that we've reached that goal yet. So watch this space. Hopefully some of the performance regression tools that the performance team is working on will help us evaluate that. What types of users actually care about Spaces? If you've got a lot of data, Spaces will be really useful to you because it limits what you can see. Obviously, it's difficult to work with a lot of data, but if you can just see the data you care about, that's going to be so useful. Also performance as well. Some of the customers that we have with a lot of data really have significant performance problems. So Spaces hopefully will be a huge benefit to those customers. If you have a lot of teams, not only will you probably have a lot of data as well, but you've probably got complex permission setups. It's going to be easier now to sort of separate permissions out into separate spaces, delegate permissions to different space owners. It's just going to be much easier to manage. Also, those teams will probably map quite nicely to Spaces as well. If you're a system admin at the moment, something that people complain about is system admins don't really want to deploy. Like, they manage users, they manage Octopus server nodes and licenses and all that kind of thing, but they don't really care about deploying projects because they're not working on projects. So they don't want to go to Octopus and see this big green deploy button that they might accidentally click. Once we've shipped Spaces, it should be possible for system administrators to restrict their own permissions such that they can't actually do anything within a space. They can only operate above a space level, at a more system level. So they're going to really love that feature. And also they're going to love being able to delegate permissions and other responsibilities to people within Spaces. And of course, security conscious users are probably going to love it as well. It's such a pain to set up permissions at the moment in some cases, and this is going to be really helpful for them. There's going to be a lot of other users as well that get benefit from Spaces. These are just some of the ones that we're concerned with at the moment. Smaller customers will probably get some value as well, depending on what they're doing. At the moment, they will be limited to 3 spaces by default. So if you want more than 3 spaces, you'll have to upgrade to the data center license. Now, this is something we've been talking quite a bit about internally. What is the interaction between spaces within Octopus? We've decided that Spaces is really a hard wall between your data. It's not like a soft wall where you might sometimes be able to reference things across that boundary. It's really a hard wall. You can't see anything past that wall. This was the example I showed you earlier, where that project that I created in the second space couldn't even see the lifecycle I created in the first space. It couldn't cross that hard wall between those 2 spaces. Another example here is if you've got a project within space A, you should not be able to deploy that project to a machine from space B. You create a machine in space B, you should have some guarantee that it's isolated and inaccessible from any other space. Now, I think that's pretty straightforward. But in terms of the details, it gets a little bit more complex. I'll expand on this a little bit more with a subsequent talk, talking about some of the technical details. But for now, I really wanted just to talk about a bit of language that's related to this problem. So this is some language that we've been using internally within the team, and it's something that will probably leak further out to at least the organization, because this pattern does arise in a lot of cases when you're talking about spaces. Hopefully we can avoid exposing this to any of our users, or at least minimize how much we expose it to our users, because it's not necessarily a simple thing to understand. So the sort of terminology is around the scoping of particular types of things within our system. This is a pattern that seems to crop up quite a lot, actually, and it's not just at our API. It crops up all over the place. It happens in the database, at our document level, in the API, of course, in the UI, in permissions. It just seems to keep appearing. So it is really kind of important to understand. So if you've got some item within a set, there's kind of three kind of ways you can categorize that set. You can say that those things are space scoped. To say that something is space scoped means that it exists within a space. It belongs to a space, exactly one space, not multiple spaces, but it always must be within one space. Most things fall in this category. This is just the sort of default category for a lot of things. Projects, life cycles, tenants, environments, machines, variable sets, all these things are space scoped. They all are assigned to a space, right? Pretty straightforward. The second category of things is things that are system scoped. These things just don't have anything to do with spaces at all. These are they're not part of the domain of spaces. They just exist outside of it. A few examples like Octopus server nodes, they've got nothing to do with spaces. They're all about the instances that you're running and the machines that they're on. That's just, totally unrelated to spaces. The scheduler that runs within Octopus, it's not really related to spaces. Sure, at times it acts on data that exists within spaces, but ultimately you've got one scheduler for the whole system. The scheduler itself is not particularly coupled to spaces. The license, so you've got one license for an installation. It's not like you have one license per space or anything like that. It's one license per installation. Sure, the license happens to define how many spaces you can use, but ultimately it's a system level concern. And another one is authentication and also the users in the system. You can imagine that we might have decided that users do belong to spaces. So you can have different users within different spaces. We decided not to go down that path, instead have users to be system scoped things. Now the third category is the interesting one, the most interesting one. This one, there's only a very small number of things that fit within this category. I think there's like 5 of them in general. These are things that are described as being mixed scope. And these things, any item within a set of mixed scope things can either be space scoped or system scoped. A couple of examples: events. So you've got your event table, all the things happening within Octopus. Each individual event might either happen within a space or have happened within a space, or an event might have happened at the system level. So for example, you've got you've created a new project within the system. Well, since projects are space scoped, the event that records the fact that you created a project is also space scoped. This means that you can just easily see all of the things that happen within your space by just filtering them down to all of the space scoped events that happen within your space. Similarly, anything that happens at a system level, well, that's a system scoped event. So we say that events as a concept are mixed scope. You can imagine in the database that mixed scope things have a space ID column, which can have a value or it could be null. It's another way of thinking about it. Space scope things, on the other hand, always have to have a non-null space ID. And system scope things in the database, there is no space ID column at all. They don't know about spaces. Teams is another example of a mixed scope thing. So you can have teams that are specific to a space, or you can have teams that are system level teams. As I said, there's only a handful of these. There's only 5 that I can think of. There's teams, there's a new thing called scope user roles, there's events, tasks, and subscriptions. So they don't appear very often, but they are a really interesting edge case when they do appear. Okay, that's all I really wanted to say about spaces for now. As I said, it's not for the most part, it's not a terribly complicated concept. But let's just switch gears a bit to talk about permissions. Now, you probably would have heard the whole project referred to internally as the Spaces and Permissions project. So there's 2 sort of things that we wanted to do with permissions. The first thing is that we realized that we needed to change the structure of permissions quite a bit in order to support Spaces. It was a dependency of the Spaces project. Additionally, we kind of realized that our permission system was just completely out of control. It was really hard to reason about. It was really hard to change. It was hard to be consistent. We were making bugs all over the place. And no one really understood what was going on. So we wanted to regain control of our permission system. The alternative would have been making all these changes to the permission system in order to support Spaces, but have no real confidence that we haven't broken anything. So instead of splitting these 2 things out into across multiple releases, we decided to just do them together. So that's why we're shipping this large permissions change at the same time as Spaces. So there's a few things involved in the permissions change apart from all the refactoring and all the implementation details that have changed. So from an external point of view, some of the main changes are you can now delegate permissions. This is a space-specific feature. So you can delegate permissions to someone who owns a space. Spaces have space owners now. You saw that in the UI before. A space owner is kind of like an admin within that space. A space owner can do anything within that space. They can't do anything outside the space, but anything within the space they can do. And therefore, space owners are usually responsible for assigning permissions within that space. So you can imagine at the moment, you might have a system admin in your organization. They can do anything within Octopus. Someone comes along and they're like, okay, I need this new permission to do something in, for whatever project I'm working on. So they need to go to someone who has that permission and ask for them to grant that permission to them. And often that's probably the system admin. So they go to the system admin and they say, hey, I need, I don't know, package push permission or something like that. But the system admin's like, okay, I don't know what that means or what that implies. I don't know how that affects other projects. I don't have the context, the required context to actually know whether or not I should be granting you that permission. So that's kind of the problem. Now, with a space owner, the actual space owner themselves is probably someone who's working on that project or creating those environments or talking to those customers that end up being tenants. They have that context required to determine what permissions are applicable within that space. Okay, so the system admins are able to delegate all of that permission assignment to space owners now if they want to. The other nice thing about this is that it means that a system admin can revoke all of the permissions within a space from themselves. So a system admin could no longer deploy a project within a space if they wished. So it means that the system admin logs into Octopus. They can only even see the system level concerns. They can't see anything that is space scoped, right? This permissions delegation. The second sort of major change we've made around permissions is the way that you assign roles and scopes to teams. So we've got this kind of problem at the moment where in Octopus today, imagine you've got a team within your organization. We'll call them the developers, right? It's a specific set of people. You got, say, 10 developers in your organization. You want to make a team out of those developers and give them certain permissions within Octopus. So in this scenario here, we've got 3 different kinds of permissions we want to assign to that team. So we've got a project. We want that team of developers to be able to deploy projects to dev, QA, and prod environments. We also want those developers to be able to manage or edit the dev and QA environments, but we don't want them to be able to edit the production environment because that's managed by someone else. But we do need them to be able to view it so that they can deploy to it. So at the moment, this is actually really difficult to set up in Octopus. You can imagine a new user coming along and trying to set this up. They might create a single team called developers, and they might give that team 3 roles: project deployer, environment manager, environment viewer. And then they might assign the 3 scopes, the 3 environments as scopes to that team, dev, QA, and prod. But that won't give them what they want, because that'll now give them environment manager access to the production environment, right? What they really want to do is have 3 separate sort of combinations of roles and scopes for that team. But at the moment, you can only have 1 combination of roles and scopes for a team. So in order to solve this problem today, you actually have to create 3 teams. So you create a team of developers, and then you give it some sort of, essentially like a namespace. You say this is the team that assigns deployment permissions to the developers. And you give them this particular combination of roles and scopes. And then you create a second team where you assign the environment manager permissions to the developers team, and then a third one for the environment viewer. The real problem here is you've now got 3 teams that contain exactly the same members, and they must contain exactly the same members too. That's because those members map directly to people within your organization. You can imagine a new developer comes on board, and then someone has to remember all of the different teams that developer needs to be added to. What would be really nice is something like this, where you've got 1 team that basically just defines the members that belong to that team. And then that team can have as many different combinations of roles and scopes as it requires. So in this case, we've got the same combinations of roles and scopes we had in the previous example, but they're all grouped individually and then assigned to that team of developers. This means you can sort of support that same scenario that we described, while only having 1 team that defines the members. So this is what we're working towards and what we've got working in the Spaces branch at the moment. The really nice thing about this pattern is that it works really nicely with Spaces. So I mentioned earlier how we now assign permissions within Spaces as well. You can imagine that in this example, you might have a developers team, and that developers team needs access to 3 different spaces, say, within your Octopus instance. And they need to have different sets of permissions within those different spaces, right? Each of those spaces might have different sets of environments, for example, or different rules about whether or not developers can manage the production environment. So you've got different permissions for the same team within different spaces. This works really nicely with this model because each of these boxes here, the role plus scope, which is, by the way, a new entity that we've called the scoped user role. So these scoped user roles, each of them is assigned a space. So this first box here might be the permissions for the developers within space A. And the second 2 boxes might be the permissions for the developer within space B. This gives us a really nice way of having 1 team that has permissions across multiple spaces. I'll show you that in the UI in a moment. The third sort of major change we're making to permissions is something we've not implemented yet. So when you're creating user roles, which is really just a set of permissions, some of those permissions are mixed scope permissions. So an example is something like task view. I mentioned how tasks themselves are mixed scope concepts, which means that you can have a task that is space scoped, for example, a deployment task, or a system scoped task, something, the task that's run at the system level and doing something that interacts with system level resources. When you're setting up a user role and you're adding one of these mixed scope permissions like task view, you need to decide whether or not that task view permission applies at the space level or the system level or both. Okay, that's something that you decide at user role creation time. And this flows through to the permissions that you get at runtime through that new concept that we just talked about, the scoped user role. Once again, this is something that we haven't finished working on yet. We've only really started on this recently, so I can't show this off to you yet. So I'm just going to jump into the UI again here and show you some of the permissions changes. So I'm going to jump over to the teams. I'm going to create a new team. I'll call this my new team. You can see there's a new option here. You get to select whether or not the team is visible only in your current space or visible in all spaces. It's visible in all spaces. You can assign permissions, different permissions in different spaces to that team. It's visible only in this space. You can only assign permissions within the current space. I'm going to create it such that it's visible in all spaces. I go over to the settings. I can see that it's selected this option here, saying that it's a global team. Won't worry about members for now. In terms of the roles, let's add a few roles to this team. So let's say I want to add the, let's say, environment manager role to this team. We've got this nice new sort of UI here to the work that allows you to manage that. You can select which space you want this role to apply to. So I want to manage environments in the default space. I'll apply that. You can see there's now a new section that's appeared on the page representing the default space and the roles that apply within it. So I might add a second role here. Let's call that project deployer, perhaps. I'll assign that to the same space. I can at this point select what scopes I want to apply for this specific combination of roles and scopes. And you can see that's now appeared once again under the default space section, which is collapsible. It shows me all the roles that apply within the default space. And it also shows me all of the scopes that apply for each specific role. You can imagine that I might add a second project deployer role with a different set of scopes. So I might have a project deployer role that allows me to deploy project A to production. And a second project deployer role that allows me to deploy project B to dev and test. Right. So those are your roles. And because it's a team, I could add permissions for a different space. So I'll add an environment viewer for the second space. And that's moved to the section here. So I can see I've got environment viewer for the second space, but environment manager for my default space. So hopefully that gives us a really nice view of all of the permissions that apply for that team, as well as giving you a nice way of split them up into different spaces. This is something that is probably one of the most valuable things to get feedback on during user testing, which is something that we're currently working towards, because this is a fairly complex screen. I think that's all I wanted to show at this point. So what's left? Well, what haven't we done? We haven't done any migration yet. By migration, I'm talking about being able to move things between spaces. So when someone first upgrades to a version of Octopus with spaces, they will get everything moved into a default space. If they want to start splitting up their data into multiple spaces, we don't really have anything to help them do that. They really have to create things from scratch in the second or in a different space, or they have to manually script against the API to move things across. So we're anticipating that some of our big customers might want to do that themselves, while some of our small customers perhaps might use spaces for new features or new teams that come along. The other thing we haven't done is sharing between spaces. So an example of this would be something like the action templates or step templates. That, or perhaps machines is another example. So these are things where you might actually want to have one definition of, say, a step template that's used by multiple spaces. At the moment, step templates are things that strictly exist within a single space. So there's no way of crossing those hard walls to access a step template from a different space. But we anticipate that people are going to want to use this for at least a few specific concepts within Octopus. So these are things that we're not going to ship with for the first version of Spaces, but we anticipate that people are really going to want them pretty soon. So we're going to, this is kind of the next thing on our roadmap after we've shipped Spaces. So what's our status? Right now, we're really focusing on getting things ready for user testing. User testing is a little bit of an unknown for us to see. We want to see whether or not our design actually works in the first place. Any changes we need to make that come out of that. So that's something that we want to hit as early as possible. We're quite close to getting things working for that though, which is essentially feature completeness. There's a few things we're fixing up around permissions and bugs at the moment for permissions. We're also working on that. There's changes to the user roles that I talked about. The next thing we're working on after that's all done and user testing underway is we'll be looking at performance testing. We're not sure if we've regressed on performance. We also want to demonstrate that there is a performance increase if you split your instance up into multiple spaces. Apart from that, marketing, blogging, making some noise, bug fixes, stabilization, documentation, all the usual sort of stuff. And all that is working towards a shipping sometime in October. Hopefully the second week is what we're currently aiming for, but we'll see how that date progresses. And that's all. If you want to get involved, we've got a permanent instance up. You can grab our code, have a play around with it. We've got a Trello board. You can see where we're up to. Apart from that, come and talk to us in the team modeling channel on Slack and leave your feedback and ask any questions there. And that's all. So thanks for listening.